The sound of a handcrafted leather loafer meeting a woman's hip echoed through the marble lounge like a crack of thunder. Lailer, 7 months pregnant and dressed in a simple waitress uniform that strained against her belly, crumpled to the polished floor. Her hands instinctively formed a protective cage around the life growing inside her. Above her stood Seon, her ex-fiancé, his designer shoes still hovering in a mocking stance, a glass of vintage wine steady in his other hand. "I told you leaving me would leave you in the gutter," Seon sneered, adjusting his silk tie, while his new fiancée watched with a high, piercing laugh. "Now look at you, serving appetizers to the man you could have married." What Seon didn't know, what the elite crowd filming on their phones with flickering, mocking flashes didn't realize, was that the hidden gemstone on Lailer's wedding ring had just been pressed. A red protocol silent alarm was currently screaming in a boardroom less than 50 yards away, belonging to the most feared man in the underworld, her husband. The Vanna Black Lounge is where the city's 1% come to hide their sins behind crystal chandeliers and $5,000 a bottle champagne. It is a place of absolute, lethal grace and suffocating silence. And there, amidst spilled hors d'oeuvres and shattered glass, Lailer lay gasping, her fingers trembling against the cold stone. The crowd froze, not out of pity, but out of a sudden, inexplicable chill. The music didn't just fade, it died. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the elevators at the back of the lounge chimed with a haunting, melodic ring. This is the first lesson you need to understand. Never kick a woman who has a dragon guarding her soul. The weight of the Vanna Black Lounge's silver serving tray was nothing compared to the weight of the secret Lailer carried beneath her heart. To the patrons of Seoul's most exclusive penthouse club, she was simply staff number 42, a silent shadow in a crisp white apron moving through the haze of expensive cologne and cigarette smoke. They saw a waitress. They didn't see the woman who, only 4 hours earlier, had been kissed goodbye in a mansion protected by reinforced steel and a small army of men. Lailer adjusted her footing, her lower back aching from the 7-month swell of her belly. She could have stayed in the penthouse. She could have spent her days draped in Hermes silk, watching the clouds drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Dragon Syndicate's headquarters. Her husband, Hong Lee, had offered her the world on a platinum platter, literally. He had bought her a gallery, a fleet of cars she didn't drive, and a staff of 30 who bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the marble when she entered a room. But that life was a gilded cage, and Lailer knew all too well what happened when a woman became nothing more than a trophy. 3 years ago, when she was with Seon, she had been a hollow shell. He had demanded she quit her studies, cut off her friends, and exist only as an extension of his ego. When he finally cast her aside for a more suitable socialite, Lailer had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a shattered sense of self. She had promised herself then, never again. When Hong Lee entered her life, a storm of charcoal suits and a terrifying, quiet power, he had fallen for the woman who was working 2 jobs to pay her way through a business degree. He didn't want a doll. He wanted a partner with fire in her veins. Yet, even with his protection, the fear remained. The fear that if she stopped moving, stopped earning, and stopped being Lailer, she would vanish into the shadow of the ghost of the underworld. "You don't have to do this, Lotus," Hong Lee had murmured that morning, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw as he watched her pin back her dark hair into a tight, professional bun. "I need to remember what the floor feels like, Lee," she had replied, leaning into his touch. "If I only ever walk on clouds, I'll forget how to stand on my own 2 feet if the sky falls." He didn't like it. The most dangerous man in Seoul loathed the idea of his pregnant wife carrying drinks for men who weren't fit to breathe her air. But he respected her steel. So, they made a pact. She would work 3 shifts a week at the lounge, a neutral territory under his indirect control, under a pseudonym. She wore no jewelry save for a simple, unassuming wedding band with a hidden GPS gemstone, a red protocol failsafe she promised never to use unless the world was ending. Lailer moved through the lounge now, weaving between the low-slung velvet sofas. She took pride in the calluses on her hands and the honest exhaustion in her legs. It was her tether to reality. Here, she wasn't the mafia's queen. She wasn't the target of rival syndicates or the subject of tabloid gossip. She was just a woman making her own way, proving to herself that even if the empire crumbled tomorrow, she would still be standing. She took a deep breath, scenting the air of the lounge, the smell of wealth, arrogance, and old money. She felt the baby kick, a strong, rhythmic thumping that made her smile. "You're going to be different," she thought, patting her apron. "You'll know what it means to work." She was reaching for a bottle of sparkling water to refill a table in the VIP section when a voice, sharp, nasal, and hauntingly familiar, cut through the ambient jazz music. "Waitress, this table is a mess. Get over here and earn your tip." Lailer's heart didn't just skip a beat, it stopped. That voice had been the soundtrack to her darkest nights. She turned slowly, her professional mask firmly in place, only to see Seon sitting in the center of the booth, his arm draped around a woman dripping in diamonds. The ghost of the past had arrived, and Lailer realized with a cold shiver that her secret life was about to collide with a very public nightmare. The evening air at the Skyline Lounge was thin and smelled of expensive gin and altitude. Lailer moved through the sea of charcoal suits and silk dresses with a practiced, invisible grace, her charcoal waitress apron tied carefully over the slight swell of her 7-month pregnancy. To the patrons of Seoul's most exclusive rooftop, she was merely a fixture of the service staff, a pair of hands to refill crystal flutes and clear away the remnants of lobster hors d'oeuvres. She preferred it this way. In the quiet rhythm of the lounge, she could forget the weight of the name she now carried, the wife of the dragon. But the peace shattered with the chime of the private elevator. Lailer was adjusting a centerpiece when the laughter reached her, a sharp, nasal sound that she recognized in her very marrow. Her blood turned to ice before she even looked up. Standing by the velvet stanchions was Seon, draped in a cream-colored Italian suit that screamed of new money and old insecurities. Clinging to his arm was a woman in a stark white power suit, her face a mask of surgical perfection and bored disdain. 2 years hadn't changed him. He still carried that same peacock arrogance, the tilt of his head suggesting he owned the oxygen everyone else was breathing. Lailer tried to turn away, to slip into the shadows of the bar, but Seon's gaze swept the room with the predatory instinct of a man looking for someone to look down on. His eyes locked onto her. The recognition was instantaneous and cruel. "Lailer." Seon's voice cut through the low hum of the jazz quartet like a jagged blade. He didn't just speak her name, he threw it at her. He walked toward her, his polished loafers clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. The crowd, sensing a spectacle, began to drift closer, their conversations dying into hushed murmurs. Seon's fiancée followed, her heels punctuating his stride with a mocking echo. "Oh my God, Seon, is this her?" The woman giggled, her eyes raking over Lailer's uniform with visible disgust. "The one you said was so ambitious?" Seon stopped inches from Lailer, the scent of his cologne, the same one he'd worn the night he'd thrown her out of his penthouse, choking her. "Ambitious? No, darling. I said she was delusional. I told my mother she'd end up exactly where she belonged once she lost my protection." He gestured vaguely at the tray in her hand. "Look at you. Still playing servant. I heard rumors you'd crawled back to the slums, but I didn't think you'd be desperate enough to show your face here." Lailer took a steadying breath, her hand instinctively dropping to the protective curve of her stomach. "I'm just doing my job, Seon. Please, just take your table." "Your job?" Seon laughed, a dry, barking sound that drew more eyes. "You were always so proud, Lailer. Even when you had nothing, you acted like you were too good for the life I gave you. And now..." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss meant for the surrounding ears. "You're pregnant. Let me guess, some line cooked from the basement? Or did you finally realize that without a man like me to pay your bills, you're just another statistic?" The fiancé leaned over, peering at Lailer's midsection as if inspecting a defect in a garment. She looks so heavy. It's almost a pity. Fancy lounges really should have a policy about visible pregnancies in the staff. It ruins the aesthetic, don't you think? Lailer felt the old heat of humiliation rising in her throat, the familiar pattern of Seon's psychological death by 1,000 cuts. He was performing for the crowd, using her as a footstool to elevate his own status. She could see the phones beginning to rise in the hands of the guests, a forest of glass and metal recording her shame. "I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down," Lailer said, her voice trembling but her gaze fixed on his. "Or what?" Seon stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. "You'll report me? To whom? The manager who's about to fire you for making my fiancée uncomfortable? You're a waitress, Lailer. You're a placeholder. You're the before in my success story." He reached out, his fingers flicking the silver tag on her apron with a sneer. He didn't see the silver ring on her left hand, hidden beneath the fold of her uniform, or the way the air in the room was beginning to grow unnaturally still. He only saw the version of her he had created in his mind, a defeated woman with no one to call. He had no idea that 3 floors up, the dragon had just stopped mid-sentence in a meeting, his eyes narrowing as a silent pulse vibrated against his skin. The dismissal was the spark that hit the powder keg of Seon's ego. In his world, a waitress didn't dismiss a man of his standing. The aesthetic of his perfect evening was being challenged by a woman he had categorized as trash. He reached out, his hand gripping her shoulder with a sudden, bruising force. "Don't you turn your back on me," he barked, loud enough to stop the jazz quartet mid-measure. Lailer tried to pull away, her boots slipping slightly on the polished marble. In the struggle, she bumped into a nearby service table, sending a stack of crystal saucers sliding. They hit the floor with a series of crystalline shatters that sounded like small explosions in the sudden silence. "Look at that," Seon's fiancée chirped, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Clumsy and pregnant. You really are a disaster, Lailer." "Clean it up," Seon commanded, his face twisting into a mask of cruel delight. "No," Lailer whispered, her voice trembling but certain. The no was the final insult. Seon didn't think. He reacted with the reflexive violence of a coward who knows he has an audience. He shoved her backward, but as Lailer stumbled, trying to find her center of gravity to protect her belly, Seon swung his leg. His polished leather loafer connected sharply with Lailer's hip, the force of the kick sending her spiraling toward the floor. The sound of her hitting the marble was sickening, a dull, heavy thud followed by the frantic rustle of her apron. Lailer crumpled into a ball, her knees pulled up, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach in a primal, protective instinct. "Oops," Seon said, a high, nervous laugh bubbling out of him as he looked at the recording phones. "I told you she was clumsy." She tripped over her own feet. Maybe if she wasn't so heavy with whatever that is, she'd have better balance. His fiancée giggled, clutching her luxury handbag closer to her chest. "She looks like a broken doll. How embarrassing for the lounge." On the floor, amidst the shards of broken crystal, Lailer's vision blurred with a cocktail of pain and white-hot rage. She felt the movement inside her, a sharp, frantic kick from the baby, and her fear was instantly replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She knew this man. She knew this pattern. And she knew that this time, she wasn't alone. Her fingers found the hidden gemstone on her left hand, the one Hong Li had insisted she wear even under her uniform. It looked like a simple black diamond, but beneath the facets sat a microscopic transmitter. She pressed it, holding the contact for 3 seconds. The red protocol. 3 floors above, in a boardroom where the lighting was dim and the mahogany table was covered in maps of the shipping docks, the air changed. Hong Li was mid-sentence, his voice a low, lethal baritone as he discussed a territory dispute. He stopped abruptly. His left wrist, wrapped in a band of black titanium, vibrated with a sharp, rhythmic pulse. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't look at his men. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, turned into obsidian voids. "The Queen," he said, the words barely a whisper but carrying the weight of a death sentence. He He rose from his chair with a predatory grace that caused his right-hand man to reach for his weapon before a command was even given. Hong Li didn't run to the door. He walked, his pace measured and terrifyingly calm, the lethal grace of a man who had just decided exactly how many people were about to die. The elevators at the rear of the Skyline Lounge operated on a separate, high-frequency motor, usually a silent hum lost beneath the chatter of the city's elite. But when the light above the doors turned a sharp, violent crimson, the mechanism groaned with a sudden, forceful urgency. The chime that followed wasn't the usual soft melody. It was a single, piercing note that demanded the room's undivided attention. The heavy brass doors slid open. Hong Li did not emerge with the frantic energy of a man in a hurry. He stepped out with the chilling, absolute composure of a god returning to a world that had forgotten his name. He was dressed in a charcoal black suit, so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin, his white shirt crisp against the dark ink of the tattoos that crept just past his collar. Behind him, 6 men, broad-shouldered shadows in identical suits, formed a phalanx of silent, disciplined steel. The lounge, which moments ago had been filled with Seon's mocking laughter and the rhythmic clicking of phone shutters, went unnervingly still. It was the bystander apathy of the elite being replaced by the primal, non-verbal dominance of a predator. The jazz quartet stopped mid-measure, the bassists bow hovering over the strings as if the very air had become too thick to move through. Hong Li's gaze did not sweep the room. It did not flicker toward the expensive art or the terrified faces of the guests. It moved in a straight, lethal line to the center of the marble floor, where Lailer lay amidst the shards of broken crystal. As he began to walk, the crowd didn't just move, they recoiled. It was like the Red Sea splitting before a dark Moses. Men in million-dollar watches scrambled backward, nearly tripping over their own chairs to clear a path. Women clutched their pearls and pulled their silk skirts away, unable to meet the obsidian voids of Hong Li's eyes. Seon was still standing over Lailer, a smug, lingering grin on his face, his chest puffed out as he looked toward the elevator to see who had dared to interrupt his performance. The grin didn't vanish all at once. It eroded. It started at the corners of his mouth and bled upward into a sickly, pale tremor. He recognized the face. Every man who dealt in the shadows of Seoul knew that sharp jawline and the icy self-control that defined the ghost of the underworld. Hong, Mr. Hong. Seon's voice was a high, thin rasp, the bravado of the last 10 minutes evaporating into a cold sweat. He took a stumbling step back, his polished loafer treading dangerously close to Lailer's hand. Hong Li didn't acknowledge Seon's existence. He didn't even blink. He walked until he was 3 paces away, the silence in the room so absolute that the sound of Lailer's ragged, pained breathing sounded like a shout. Hong Li stopped. He looked at the shattered saucers, then at the smudge of dirt on Lailer's apron, and finally at the way she was cradling her stomach. His jaw tightened, a microscopic movement that, to those who knew him, was the equivalent of a declaration of war. His right-hand man, Lee Hyun-woo, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd with a soldier's precision. He saw the recording phones, the smirking fiancé who was now trying to hide behind a pillar, and the man who had dared to raise his foot. Lockdown, Hong Li said. The word was quiet, barely a whisper, but it carried the finality of a gavel. Hyun-woo nodded once and tapped a device on his wrist. At the far ends of the lounge, the heavy, reinforced steel security shutters began to descend over the floor-to-ceiling windows. The mechanical grinding sound echoed through the marble hall like a death knell. The main entrance hissed as the electronic bolts engaged, sealing the elite of Seoul inside the Skyline Lounge with the man they feared most. The red protocol was no longer a signal, it was now a reality. Hong Li slowly reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pair of black leather gloves, pulling them on one finger at a time as he finally turned his gaze toward Seon. "You have 10 seconds, Hong Li said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that made the crystal glasses on the tables hum. "To explain why your foot is still touching the ground my wife is lying on." The mechanical symphony of a lockdown was the only sound in the room, a series of heavy, metallic thuds as the reinforced shutters met the marble floors. The Skyline Lounge, once a soaring sanctuary of glass and light, was transformed in seconds into a windowless, light-choked vault. The city lights of Seoul were swallowed by the steel, leaving the elite patrons trapped in the amber glow of the emergency lamps. "My phone," a woman whispered frantically, her thumb tapping rhythmically against her screen. "The signal, it's gone." A ripple of panicked murmurs followed as the guests realized the bars on their devices had vanished, replaced by the hollow, no service icon. Lee Hyun-woo stood near the elevator bank, holding a small, matte black device that emitted a faint, high-frequency hum. The jammer was absolute. Every live stream was cut, every recording frozen, and every call for help silenced before it could leave the room. This social death that Hong Lee promised had begun, not by stopping the recording, but by ensuring that the only record of this night would be the one he controlled. Hong Lee didn't look at the panicked crowd. He moved with a terrifyingly slow grace, the leather of his gloves creaking as he fisted his hands. He reached the edge of the shattered porcelain and stopped. He didn't tower over Lailer. Instead, he knelt. The shift in his posture was jarring, from the apex predator to the protective husband. He placed a large, gloved hand on her shoulder, his touch light enough to be a ghost's caress. "Jagiya," he murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge but retaining its lethal depth. "Can you move? Look at me." Lailer looked up, her face pale, the tracks of dried tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. "The baby," she rasped, her voice trembling. "He kicked me, Hong Lee. He actually kicked me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Hong Lee's eyes stayed on his wife for a heartbeat longer, ensuring she was stable, before he rose. As he straightened his spine, the air in the lounge seemed to disappear. He turned his gaze to Seon, who was now backed against a marble pillar, his cream-colored suit looking yellow and cheap under the emergency lights. "The dead of a kick," Hong Lee said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that made the crystal glasses on the tables hum in a frantic, glass-shattering frequency. "In my world, we don't settle debts with money. We settle them with interest." He gestured with a single finger. Two of his men, shadows in the dim light, stepped forward and gripped Seon's arms. Seon let out a high, strangled yelp as he was hauled forward into the center of the room, his feet dragging across the very floor where Lailer had fallen. "Mr. Hong, please." Seon's fiancée screamed, her voice cracking as she clutched her luxury handbag like a shield. He didn't know. It was an accident. He thought she was just a waitress. Hong Lee turned his head slightly, a cold, predatory tilt. "A waitress? You think the uniform defines the woman?" He walked toward Seon, stopping so close that the coward could see his own terrified reflection in the obsidian of Hong Lee's eyes. "She is the owner of this building. She is the mother of the next head of the Dragon Syndicate. And she is the only reason I am letting you breathe for one more minute." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a shout in the silence of the lockdown. "You sealed your exits the moment you raised your foot. Now, you will sit. You will wait. And you will watch as I strip away every single thing that gave you the courage to be a monster." He turned back to his men. "Bring the chairs. Put them in the center. We have much to discuss before the sun rises." The trap had snapped shut. The exits were gone. The signals were dead. And the only authority left in the world was the man in the charcoal suit. The transition from the god of death to a man of absolute devotion was a sight that chilled the room more than any shout could have. Hong Lee ignored the elite of Seoul, ignored the sobbing fiancée, and ignored the man trembling in his men's grasp. He stepped over the glittering remains of the broken crystal and knelt in the shards. He didn't care for the silk of his trousers or the blood-stained floor. His large, gloved hand reached out, cupping Lailer's face with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a man who had built an empire on violence. His thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his eyes searching hers with a frantic, silent intensity. "Lailer," he whispered, his voice a low, raw rasp. Breathe with me. I have you. Lailer leaned into his touch, her fingers gripping his forearm, feeling the iron strength beneath the charcoal wool. The baby, he kicked me, Hong Li. He actually kicked me, she repeated, her voice a fragile thread. For exactly 3 seconds, Hong Li closed his eyes. The onlookers, the CEOs, the heiresses, and the socialites, held their collective breath. To them, this was the most terrifying moment of the night. They saw the ghost of the underworld vulnerable, his humanity exposed through the woman on the floor. It was a primal revelation. A man who loved this fiercely would burn the entire city to ash to keep that woman safe. His tenderness wasn't a weakness, it was the eye of a hurricane. Hyun-woo. Hong Li commanded without looking back, his voice returning to that icy, rhythmic baritone. The medical team. Now. They are in the elevator, boss, his right-hand man replied instantly. Hong Li shifted, sliding one arm beneath Lailer's knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her as if she were made of the finest porcelain, rising from the floor in one fluid, powerful motion. He held her against his chest, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. The contrast was stark, the rugged, scarred man in black and the pale, pregnant woman in a simple waitress apron. He turned his gaze back to Seon. The softness he had shown Lailer vanished, replaced by a gaze so devoid of mercy that Seon actually doubled over, gagging on his own fear. You thought she was alone, Hong Li said, the words echoing through the sealed vault of the lounge. You saw a uniform and assumed she had no shield. You saw her belly and assumed she was weak. He stepped toward the center of the room, Lailer still cradled in his arms. He looked at the 2 chairs his men had placed under the emergency lights, a stage for the reckoning. Every person in this room watched, Hong Li continued, his eyes raking over the crowd. You filmed it. You whispered. You waited for the show to end. Now, the show belongs to me. He walked to the first chair and sat down, settling Lailer gently onto his lap. He draped his coat over her legs, his hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach, feeling for the heartbeat of his heir. He looked like a king on a dark throne, his queen held close, while the man who had dared to touch her stood broken before them. The doctor will examine her here, Hong Li said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the hair on the back of Seon's neck stand up. And while he checks for every bruise, every scratch, and every fear you put into my family, you will tell me exactly how you want to be destroyed. The medical team emerged from the elevator, their faces pale but their hands steady. They moved with military efficiency, setting up a perimeter around the boss and his wife. The lounge was silent, save for the rhythmic clink of medical instruments and the ragged, sobbing breath of the man in the cream-colored suit, who finally realized that he had not just kicked a waitress. He had signed his own death warrant. The emergency lighting pulsed a rhythmic, sickly amber, casting long, distorted shadows of the medical team as they worked in hushed, mechanical precision around Hong Li and Lailer. The only other sound in the vaulted lounge was the ragged, wet breathing of Seon, who remained pinned by the gaze of the shadow dragon. But it was the woman standing behind Seon, the socialite in the white power suit, whose world was the first to truly implode. Min he had spent her entire life calculating the value of the people in a room. She was a woman who traded in reputations and leveraged family names like currency. When she had first seen Lailer, she had seen a zero, a decimal point at the end of Seon's grander story. But as she watched the most feared man in the Seoul underworld cradle the waitress, with a reverence that bordered on the sacred, the math finally shifted. The blood drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a cracked porcelain mask. She recognized the black diamond ring on Lailer's finger. She recognized the obsidian depth of Hong Li's eyes. Most importantly, she recognized the red protocol signal that had just turned an elite rooftop into a tomb. Seon, she whispered, her voice a thin, brittle reed. She took a staggering step back, her luxury handbag slipping from her numb fingers and hitting the marble with a dull, heavy thud. Seon didn't look back. He was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the charcoal-clad men surrounding him. Minhee, tell them, he stammered, his voice cracking. Tell them who my father is. Tell them we're supposed to be at the Blue House dinner next week. Minhee didn't move toward him. Instead, she recoiled as if he were covered in a visible, infectious rot. Your father? She spat, the words dripping with a sudden, sharp venom. Your father is a dead man walking if he shares your name tonight. She turned toward Hong Lee, her knees hitting the floor before her brain could even process the command. She didn't look at Seon again. To her, he was already a ghost. Mr. Hong, she cried, her voice echoing off the steel shutters. Please. I had no part in this. I didn't know. He told me she was a nobody. He told me she was a stalker from his past who wouldn't let go. She crawled forward a few inches, her hands raised in a gesture of frantic supplication. I would never. I have the utmost respect for the House of Lee. Please, don't let his insanity ruin my family. Seon spun around, his mouth agape. Minhee, what are you doing? We're engaged. Engaged to a corpse, she shrieked, her eyes wide with a primal terror. She looked at Lailer, who was resting her head against Hong Lee's shoulder, her pale face framed by his dark suit. Please, madam. Tell him. I didn't touch you. I tried to stop him. I was horrified. The lie hung in the air, thick and oily. Everyone in the room had heard her laughter. Everyone had seen her sneer. Hong Lee didn't look at her. He kept his hand resting firmly over Lailer's stomach, his fingers splayed, as if shielding his child from the very sound of Minhee's voice. Hyun-woo, he said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone. Sir, remove her from the center. She is noise. Two enforcers stepped forward. Minhee didn't fight them. She let them drag her toward the perimeter, her eyes fixed on the floor, her silence a total and absolute abandonment of the man she had promised to marry. She had made her choice. The social death of Seon was a price she was more than willing to pay to keep her own pulse beating. Seon stood alone now, the aesthetic of his perfect life stripped away until he was nothing but a man in a rumpled suit standing in the middle of a nightmare. He looked at his fiancée's retreating back, then at the silent, recording crowd, and finally back to the man on the dark throne. The betrayal was the first cut, but as Hong Lee's hand moved from Lailer's stomach to the phone being handed to him by his assistant, Seon realized the true execution was only just beginning. The medical team had finished their preliminary check, their quiet confirmation that Lailer and the baby were stable, acting as the only reprieve in a room otherwise thick with the scent of an impending execution. Hong Lee did not move his hand from Lailer's stomach. The warmth of his palm remained a steady, grounding weight against her skin, even as his eyes transitioned back into the cold, obsidian voids of the syndicate leader. Hyun-woo, Hong Lee said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to hum through the very marble of the floor. The phone. His right-hand man stepped forward, placing a sleek, encrypted device into Hong Lee's waiting gloved hand. The room was so silent that the rhythmic beep 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 of the dial tone sounded like a countdown. Hong Lee tapped a button, and the voice of a man, harried, elderly, and clearly awakened from a deep sleep, filled the lounge over the crystal-clear speakerphone. Who is this? Do you have any idea what time it is? The voice belonged to Chairman Kong, Seon's father, a man whose textile empire was the only thing keeping Seon's lifestyle afloat. Chairman Kong, Hong Lee said, his tone devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of a falling guillotine. This is Hong Lee. There was a sharp, audible gasp on the other end of the line. The sound of a chair scraping against a floor followed, as if the chairman had scrambled to stand at the mere mention of the name. Mr. Hong, to what do I owe this honor? If there is a problem with the logistics contract. The problem is your son, Hong Lee interrupted, his gaze fixed on Seon, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were audibly chattering. He is currently standing in my lounge. He decided that a pregnant woman in a waitress apron was beneath his notice. He decided to put his foot on my wife. The silence from the phone was deafening. It was the silence of a man watching his entire legacy crumble in a single sentence. He did what? The chairman whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, visceral terror. Mr. Hong, please. He's a fool. He's a child. I will apologize. I will. You will do nothing, Hong Li said. Because as of this moment, Kong Enterprises no longer exists in my city. I am pulling every line of credit. I am notifying the port authorities of the discrepancies in your last 3 shipments. And as for Seon, Hong Li paused, his thumb brushing Lailer's hand. He is no longer your heir. If you wish to keep your own head, you will disown him before I hang up this phone. I understand. The chairman sobbed, the sound of a broken man echoing through the speakers. He is nothing to me. He is a stranger. Please, Mr. Hong, just spare the rest of the family. Hong Li disconnected without a word. He didn't wait for the tears. He immediately tapped a second speed dial. Director Kim, Hong Li said as the call connected. The personal accounts of one Seon Kong. Freeze them. Every one. Every offshore holding. Every credit line. Flag them for suspected money laundering. Do it now. Consider it done, Mr. Hong, the banker replied, his voice professional and terrified. Seon watched in real time as his world was liquidated. His phone, which had been buzzing incessantly in his pocket, suddenly chimed with a series of frantic, final alerts. His credit cards were dead. His inheritance was gone. His father had traded him for survival. The social death was complete. He was no longer a wealthy businessman, an heir, or an elite. He was a man with no name, no money, and no exits, standing in a room full of people who were recording his absolute ruin. Hong Li handed the phone back to Hyunwoo, his expression as calm as a frozen lake. He looked down at Lailer, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second before returning to the broken man in the center of the room. You told my wife she was a statistic, Seon, Hong Li said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the emergency lights flicker. You were wrong. You are the statistic now. The first one of the year to lose everything before the sun even rises. The transition from financial ruin to judicial finality was a quiet, clinical process. Hong Li didn't need to raise his voice. The vacuum of power he had created around Seon was more than enough to suffocate the man. While Seon stared at the dark screen of his useless phone, Hong Li's hand remained a protective anchor over Lailer's stomach, feeling the steady, rhythmic life that Seon had tried to snuff out with a leather heel. Director Han, Hong Li called out, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the sealed lounge. A man in a sharp security uniform stepped from the periphery, snapping to attention. Sir. The footage, Hong Li commanded. Display it. Across the back wall of the lounge, a massive projection screen descended, humming as it came to life. Every recording phone in the room was useless, but the syndicate's private surveillance was pristine. The high-definition video looped the moment of the assault. Seon's sneer, the arrogant tilt of his head, and finally, the cowardly swing of his leg that sent a 7-month pregnant woman to the cold marble. In the 4K clarity, the intent was undeniable. The crowd gasped, the collective sound echoing like a dying breath. It wasn't just a clumsy accident anymore. It was a recorded felony. In this country, the assault of a pregnant woman is not a simple misdemeanor, Hong Li said, his voice dropping to a temperature that made the emergency lights seem dim. Under Article 257 of the Criminal Act, aggravated by the vulnerability of the victim, you are looking at a minimum of 7 years. But we aren't stopping at the assault. Hong Li gestured to Hyunwoo, who opened a leather dossier and began reading with the dry, terrifying detachment of a judge. Illegal gambling debts in Macau. 3 counts of tax evasion through your father's shell companies. And the private investigators I hired an hour ago have already recovered the deleted messages you sent to your previous assistant, the one you paid to keep silent about your temper. Seon's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the marble, his forehead pressing against the same floor where Lailer had bled shards of crystal. Please, he whimpered, the sound wet and pathetic. I'll leave. I'll go to another country. I'll never look at her again. You won't be looking at anything but the 4 walls of a cell, Hong Li replied. He leaned down slightly, his eyes locking onto Seon's with a predatory focus. You told Lailer the police wouldn't care about a waitress. You were wrong. They care very much when the complainant is the woman who owns the very precinct they work in. The heavy doors of the lounge hissed as the electronic locks finally disengaged. But it wasn't the way out Seon had hoped for. A phalanx of officers in dark blue uniforms entered, led by a chief who bowed deeply toward Hong Li before turning toward the man on the floor. There was no hesitation, no questioning of Seon's status. The status was gone. Seon Kong. The chief barked, the metallic clack of handcuffs echoing through the room. You are under arrest for aggravated assault, financial fraud, and witness tampering. You do not have a right to bail. As the officers hauled Seon up, his cream-colored suit now stained with the dust of his own downfall, Hong Li stood. He lifted Lailer with him, his arm firm around her waist, ensuring she didn't have to look at the man being dragged away. The trap is closed, Seon, Hong Li whispered as the coward passed them. And I've ensured you'll be in the general population. They have very specific opinions about men who kick pregnant women. The heavy silence that had descended upon the Vanta Black lounge was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic clicking of handcuffs. Seon's face was a mask of pathetic disbelief, his skin the color of curdled cream as two officers, men who usually bowed to his father, tightened the steel around his wrists. He looked less like the high society heir he pretended to be and more like a cornered animal, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit where the flashing blue and red lights of the authorities pulsed against the tinted glass. This is a mistake, Seon shrieked, his voice cracking, losing its polished edge. Do you know who my father is? Do you know my standing in this city? One of the officers, a veteran with a weary expression, didn't even look up as he read the charges. Assault of a pregnant woman, aggravated battery, and as of 3 minutes ago, a full forensic audit of your offshore accounts has been triggered by the Ministry of Justice. You aren't going home tonight, Mr. Kong, or for many nights after. Lailer stood perfectly still, her hand resting over the curve of her belly where her child had finally settled into a calm, steady rhythm. For years, Seon's voice had been a whip that drew blood from her self-esteem, a phantom that followed her into her dreams to remind her she was nothing. But as she watched him struggle, his expensive silk suit rumpled and his dignity dissolving into frantic sobs, the phantom evaporated. He wasn't a giant. He was a small, cruel man who had mistaken cruelty for power. Hong Li stepped closer to her, his presence a wall of heat and obsidian strength. He didn't look at Seon. To the dragon of soul, the man was already a ghost, a discarded piece of trash cleared from the path. His entire focus was on the woman at his side. With a gentleness that made the remaining socialites gasp in whispered shock, he reached out and adjusted the lapel of Lailer's coat, which one of his men had draped over her shoulders to hide the torn waitress apron. Are you ready to go home, my queen? Hong Li asked. His voice wasn't the lethal grace he used for his enemies. It was a low, private rumble meant only for her. Lailer looked at him, then back at the lounge, the place where she had tried to hide her identity to prove her worth. She realized now that her worth didn't come from the apron, nor did it come solely from the man holding her hand. It came from the fact that she had survived the fire Seon had started, and she had built a garden in the ashes. I am, Lailer said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the room. As they turned to leave, the crowd parted like a retreating tide. There were no more mocking flashes, no more condescending whispers. There was only the heavy, reverent silence reserved for the matriarch of the Shadow Dragon Syndicate. At the threshold of the lounge, Lailer paused and looked back one last time. She saw Seon being forced into the elevator, his knees buckling, his future erased in a single night of blind arrogance. She felt a surge of triumph, but it wasn't the loud, violent kind. It was quiet. It was the feeling of a heavy chain finally snapping and falling away. They stepped out into the crisp night air of Gangnam. A fleet of black sedans sat idling, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of predators. Hong Li handed her into the lead car with the care one might afford a piece of priceless jade. As the door closed, sealing out the noise of the city, he took her hand in his, his thumb tracing the gemstone on her ring that had changed everything. "You never have to look back again," he promised. Lailer leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the neon lights of the city blur into streaks of gold and violet as they sped away. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective certainty. She was no longer a waitress hiding from her past. She was a mother, a wife, and a ruler. The dragon was by her side, but the fire, that was all hers.